All right, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think the main motivation behind doing this was, Robert and Prashant came up to us and was like, hey, we're trying to test out new features, new functionalities. We want to move some of our functionality out to Akamai Edge, but there's no easy way to test these things out, because the only way we do it is if we push everything out to production and we do sort of live testing. It did not fly very well with Scott, who's our sponsor here. So we decided to come up with something creative. Now, but the main motivation was obviously we wanted to make sure that we securely expose some of the internal environments, test some of the newer features without actually, doing the entire push to production. But we also wanted to validate it with all the Akamai functionality that was existing in production. They also wanted to do global sort of multi-device testing, as well as test some of the Akamai functionalities in their dev environments. So that was sort of the main motivation behind this. And the key thing was for them, they wanted to test things that were behind the firewall. And so that put a lot of restrictions in place. As you know, InfoSec is usually pretty hard on these things. Before we dive into some of the details, just a show of hands, who all are developers here? DevOps, operation folks, business. Okay, so it seems to be a good mix. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk about the motivation, and then Prashant and Robert are going to talk about what we did exactly as part of this integration. But really, the key thing of this topic is for you guys to ask questions and keep this interactive, and feel free to ask what's going on, how do we do this, how do we scale this, so on and so forth. With that, I'll hand it over to Prashant.
So the way we kind of got started on this journey was really when we started to take a look at the redirect rules that Chris was alluding to earlier. Because you have customers in different parts of the world, China, Asia Pacific, Europe, and when they're coming in, a lot of the application rules. So, for example, Google has a link to one of your product pages indexed, and you've changed the URL because you replatformed. You need to make sure that to maintain SEO equity, those things get redirected correctly. So that's one simple example, and there's quite a few other things like navigation and things like that are kind of important for us, especially as we migrate from an old platform to a new platform. And over time, what really ended up was we were managing all of the redirect rules at the origin using a reverse proxy. So that's sort of how it started to become. As you can see here, we had several thousand lines of configuration code that was basically mapping URLs. From this was the old URL, this is the new URL, and if you had this this particular piece of the URL available, we were then filling out other pieces of the URL based on some complex logic, and then redirecting the user to the right destination. So there are two major problems with that. One was your users' experience kind of suffers because if they're coming in from, or if they're on their phone on a bad network, or if they're coming in from a different country, because these rules are mainly processed at the origin. Some of them are cached, but some of them are really complex. So the cache hit ratio doesn't really sort of help that much. They were kind of experiencing a lot of redirects, and so that ended up affecting their performance because of latencies. So one of the motivations was, well, is there a way for us to manage these redirects as long as we need them at the edge, so that way we can offload all of that processing to the edge, and then that way they would get a quicker response. So that was one of the key motivations. But as we started to go down this approach, the other process is, well, we have all these rules today, which are managed by a couple of people who really know that really well. If you do go about changing them, then how do we ensure that we don't break functionality? And so being able to automate that, some of the testing ahead of time is kind of key. And something of this, scale of, Dell.com, there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of, traffic coming in. We really can't, take, cause outages because of changing in the in the redirect rules. So we really needed a solution that sort of addressed those two key pain points. And of course, Edge Redirector was something that was available to us already. And so we said, okay, well, let's see what it would take to migrate some of these rules over to Edge Redirector Cloudlet. And then as we started talking a little bit more about, well, how do we test that, and then how do we make sure that, we're able to ensure that things, work correctly in the kind of the testing environment before we actually promote it to production. That's when we talked to Akamai, and then we were able to identify EAA as a potential solution to the problems. Obviously, by doing that, there's some other benefits too, which is that your site uptime goes up potentially because of the fact that there's more offload from the origin to the edge. And of course, the page load times will potentially drop because of the redirects being handled at the edge. One of the other kind of requirements also was as we started looking a little bit more into the EAA product, we started to discover more interesting use cases that we could potentially use it for. An example is if we have a lot of delivery configs, right? So for example, we use the caching, we use FEO, one of their products, we use image managers, a lot of interesting other things technologies that we use on some of our production properties that we never ever get to use in the non-production environment. And we've had some, we would launch something, we would test a little bit, but then things don't really become clear until it hits scale. Like when you have more traffic coming in, you see more issues, and different browsers behave differently for some of these sensitive configurations that we push, particularly around FEO or front-end optimization. So we said, okay, well, this is something that we can now easily test in a testing environment before we roll it out. And so that was another interesting use case that EAA actually enabled. The other big use case that we'll sort of go over was because we went responsive, we actually built a responsive experience. So in other words, Dell.com today in the US and in some of the countries in EMEA, whether you browse on on your phone or on your tablet or notebook, whatever, you actually get the same experience. It's just that it's responsive. And with that, we had a lot of other challenges too, in that you want to make sure that experience is optimal on mobile devices. And there's a plethora of mobile devices all over the world. And we needed a way to test that with all of the optimizations that we would normally enable in production. We previously couldn't do that because we could only do some of it. Our testing environment doesn't quite support all of the the complex configurations that we have in place. And so this actually really came in and turned out to be a really nice way for us to expose some of this functionality, particularly because you can authenticate your users and they can securely access your private builds and assets and things like that without having to worry about that leaking anywhere. The other requirement, of course, is if you're testing on mobile devices, obviously you're not going to be able to get on a VPN and do all these things that we would normally do. And so this was another good solution because it's able to come in the way and intercept requests coming to your test URL, and users then have to kind of log in and then they get to the experience. So that worked out really well for us, and it helped solve a lot of interesting problems. And as I was kind of alluding to, there are other more interesting use cases that we're discovering as we actually go through this process of making it like live and productionalized. And I'll quickly hand over to Robert. He's going to kind of go into more detail about exactly how we implemented EAA on Dell and kind of some of the things that we've gone through along the journey.
Thank you. So we'll just jump right in. Basically, it's a complex problem, so there's nothing you can really do to come up with a solution other than just jump in, try to think outside the box, and try out different solutions. So, we tried out different ideas and approaches, and one of the things that we were trying were the device testing, where you could, there's these different products that do device testing, and we were gonna, the trouble with those is that they didn't allow the testing of the property manager policies, only partially solved the problem because it didn't allow LDAP authentication. There's other issues. We thought about writing our own redirect manager, but that would take too long and it really wouldn't solve all the problems. The main problem we're trying to solve is reducing the time of redirects. So if you're coming in from china.dell.com, you get redirected to dell.com/ZHCH. Then you get redirected again because it's a deals that doesn't exist anymore. Redirect again, you get redirected because the product doesn't exist anymore. There's a new product. So there's a lot of looping there. So if we could push that out to the edge so that those redirects are zipping quickly out on the edge, it would save the user experience a lot of time. So another approach we looked at was, we thought what we really need is a DMZ, where we can hit the Akamai servers outside the network, but also can hit our testing environments that are isolated, black boxed inside of our network. So we looked into that. The network guys frowned on that for a few reasons. It's a pain to set up. It's a pain to maintain. There's whitelists, there's blacklists. There's some security issues. There's problems with authentication. You got to build an authentication system. Who's going to maintain it? Who's going to build it? And so it really comes down to bureaucracy. There's like a lot of dependencies you've got to get involved in, a lot of teams you got to interlock with. There's a lot of mother may I, and who's going to maintain it. And so that's when we went to Akamai and said, we'd like to set up a DMZ, would you be able to help with that? And they said, well, we've got this product that we normally use for like getting into like Salesforce or something like that. And it can also get used to access the intranets. So it's kind of a DMZ as a service. It's called EAA. It doesn't require a VPN. It uses standard ports, which aren't blocked by the firewall. So you don't have to even get the firewall guys involved to bypass it or open up ports or anything. And it's just a drop-in VM network appliance. So there's not even much setup. So we decided to do a proof of concept with it. And basically, it's pretty simple. This is like a kind of a whiteboard drawing of it. But you can see at the bottom there at the base is the user. He comes in using a mobile device or a laptop, and from inside or outside the network. And from there, he hits our test environment URL, testg4dell.com, and that gets sent to the EAA connector on the Akamai side. And that resolves to the staging environment for the edge redirector, for the URL redirect rules. And then that comes back, bypassing the firewall, into the connector side on our side in the Dell network. And that can access our internal testing environments. And so what was neat, we already had the reverse proxy set up to access those intranets, and so they just had to connect into that. And here's another way of looking at that same information. So basically, to emphasize, there's no hole in the firewall. There's no complex configuration on our side. There's no client software we got to do, and they're isolated. They're locked in. There's no lateral movement. They can't get in outside of where we let them go into. So you can see the users go in through the Akamai access point. It's just like a little pop-up that comes up that just you can log in with your network password, so you don't even have to give users a new password. They just log in with their network credentials like they always do. Bypasses the firewall, hits the connector, and then from there it gets redirected to the various testing environments. It's pretty slick. So to set it up, they sent us the Hyper-V connector images, which we installed our environment. We just used their Akamai portal to configure it. We've already had the reverse proxies pointing to our test environments. And then we just added users and groups using the AD connector. You just point it to your own network AD groups and users, and they log in normally. And then once it's all set up, you've got complete access to it as if they're right there in the environment, as if you had remoted into the box. It's really good. And then once we got that done, we can set up all these kinds of automated testing. We've built this automated testing suite that hits different redirect rules with the expectations versus what we actually got. Akamai set up a header on all the redirect requests that give you the Akamai ER rule ID, so you can see exactly which rule was actually tripped. So if you get some strange behavior and you try to figure out what went wrong, you immediately see what rule was actually tripped. And we can put that in our test environment there, and you can see it quickly. Helps with testing. You see which ones passed and failed. And then we also set up a system that would migrate policies between policies, because you have to set up a different policy for each of the test environments. And so we've got an automated system using the Akamai web API to migrate those policies between environments, and then you use their tool to publish to production. So that's it. So I kind of like rushed through it, so I just kind of wanted to open up to questions. If you want more depth, I think we got one already here. You want to go on a little bit?
Yeah. So a lot of the EAA I see uses logging in that conditions or something. What about pen test servers?
Yeah. So
do you want to repeat the question really quick?
Yeah, I think the question was, if you're doing automated tests and things like that need to authenticate through the EAA and hit your non-prod environment. Sean is there. We're actually working on a thing where I think you can actually add a header to it, and you can indicate whether this traffic is coming from your API or if it's coming from a user. So then the rule engine will check to see if that header exists. Both the headers exist. First one indicates if it's from an automated, API or like a system that's trying to get through it, and the second will basically have the authorization header. So we're actually working on getting that set up, but I think it's very much doable.
Yeah. And it's neat because we'll be able to test from you can test the UI locally. You're developing, trying to figure out something. You can just point to the web API and
exactly.
Yeah.
We're actually working on a separate use case that is pretty similar in that we have something running. Let's say a developer on the workstation wants to point to an API that's behind an Akamai policy. You want to see how the code interacts. So that's effectively the same strategy we're taking, where we're adding those two headers, and then that basically gets propagated through, and then EAA then knows to let that particular request go through, and it sees the combination of the headers.
Right. So the question is, where was the test environment for folks who might not be able to hear over there?
Yeah. So our test environments are all pretty much located on-prem in our own data center. They're not in the DMZ. They're in different labs that are within the infrastructure. But because you have an appliance that is installed on-prem, it can then talk to your environment and then basically act as a relay, right? So you use the portal to kind of configure what you want, but when you actually hit the application, it basically uses the appliance to kind of gather all that information and then push it out, so that way when you come out from outside or inside, you hit that URL, you go through the appliance, and then you get the exact same experience. It sort of acts as a proxy, but a proxy that doesn't require a firewall. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Directory services, did you use like the cloud directory? Did you use your own SDE servers? What directories?
No, actually.
So the question, real quick, the question was, what directory source did you use? Did you use your internal Active Directory or LDAP or a cloud directory?
We actually used our own Active Directory LDAP. We just needed, depending on Windows, if you have an account that has just about enough permissions to sync the Active Directory groups, right? It'll all appear on the portal. Yeah. I think there's a screenshot of that actually. So
we can.
Yeah.
Jump to that. Yeah.
So right there, you can kind of determine what the directory service is, and then you can put like the information here, and it actually syncs up all your Active Directory groups. So when you want to give somebody access, you just find their name or the group in the portal, and then you add them to whichever applications. In our case, we right now have a couple of applications, but potentially you could have more applications. If you had your own internal, SharePoint or whatever it is that you wanted to expose, you could add permissions to specific applications for specific groups.
And you can create custom groups as well, so you don't have to give full access to an entire group. You say like, sync up with this group, but really only pull these 3 people out, give them access. You can create another group saying, executives or something like that, and we gave those 3 guys the rights to it. So, and then we deleted the group, the massive group, out of the sync, so it didn't keep syncing up the group. So yeah, and that saves bandwidth and stuff. Yeah, you would sync up the whole group. You would just take in and say like bring in whatever all users. It takes a few minutes to sync up. You pull out the handful that you want, put it into a custom group, put them in that, assign the permissions to that custom group. Then you just delete the users group from the sync, and so it's not syncing all 50,000 people from that big list. Yeah. Or you can say like, here's a group called developers. Pull that in, sync it, and just give the rights straight to that group and just leave it there forever. So that way all new developers always come in.
A question right here.
I don't know if you guys discussed, what Akamai features can we use with this? And can I take advantage of the WAF, like Code Defender? Can I get show out this?
We should be able to, because right now we're using Edge Redirector. He was asking what Akamai tools you can test with it.
Yeah, the idea really is to enable development teams to end-to-end task against the Akamai platform, against your Akamai services, your Akamai config, essentially earlier in the SDLC, the software development lifecycle, right? Versus having a strict pre-production environment with a lot, shared pre-production environment with a lot of change controls around it. Essentially enable your development team, your testing teams to test earlier in the SDLC, finding those potential interoperability issues earlier in a testing cycle, right? Ron Patton wrote, I think, that it's logarithmic with time, that the more time that goes by, the higher the cost of finding a bug. If you find a bug in the 11th hour, by then it's too late, and you've cost yourself, maybe by a factor of 10, time, effort, money.
Yeah, I'll just repeat the question. The question was, can you test, use like Akamai Kona Site Defender and Cloudlets? So yes, if you look at this architecture, right, essentially in front of the access point, you can put the Akamai like Ion platform, and so the moment you put that, you can put Kona on there, and you can test the entire production setup that you have. In fact, what the future model is that we're thinking with Dell is, over time we automate the whole thing out. So now you could have APIs that can control both Kona as well as your Ion configs, and as part of your build process, you develop a new feature, you put it in your dev environment. With the APIs, you maintain your delivery config, and then you have automated tests to run that. And if they are all successful, you push them to your next environment and your next environment, and then you push it to production. So you could do an entire CI/CD model, but testing end to end from your environment all the way to your production.
Love it. A question back here, real quick.
So from a security perspective, are you looking at, have you looked at a two-factor way to secure it? Obviously, you have any integration happening there, but are you also looking at enabling two-factor authentication?
So the question was, is Dell looking to enable two-factor authentication, which, by the way, is a part of the access solution checkbox. You can enable that, Dell?
Yeah, I think we will at some point. I think once we get past the stage where...
Yeah, we're just doing proof of concept now, but as soon as we start really getting it, we'll definitely turn that on.
Yeah, follow on to that is, have you experienced any issues with testing having developer testing for the platform versus testing directly to the box? Have you guys be able to collect any issues or logging from the actual platform as well? Let's say you're testing something and it's not working, but you were to test directly against your environment.
So the question was, are there metrics yet about to quantify interoperability issues? Basically, to summarize, paraphrase what you were saying. I'm turning it over to you.
I think the biggest one we had was how our authentication system works. So when you log into Dell, you have a My Account. So that was actually a fairly, that was actually our kind of litmus test. If it got through that, then probably work with all other features on Dell.com. And I think we actually got that to work successfully because the authentication system does, a single sign-on thing, and then it adds certain things to the
It redirects to another site and back, and it was complex. And we knew it was going to be a problem child. We've had trouble with it before with other things, so we made sure to specifically put that in the proof of concept to make sure if you can get past this, you can solve all the problems. And it took a little bit of back and forth to discovery, try to figure it out. It's just basically it was easy on our end. We just record some trace logs and some network traffic so they could see what was happening, and they set it up on their end.
One thing I'll add to that, really, these folks are doing some really advanced stuff, right? But I, anecdotally, I can tell you that such a common thing when you work with caching, right, is developing a new feature that maybe wasn't tagged quite appropriately, and so works absolutely in a sort of unit test environment. But then when you take your Akamai caching config, your Akamai caching rules, all of a sudden, because something was mistagged, you're caching a piece of content that needs to be dynamic for the application to function. Just to give you, talking about the most basic thing you can do with Akamai, right, which is caching, you can absolutely find yourself with interoperability issues.
From an interconnectivity perspective, or so if we were to test out their answer app, it would work just fine. But then when they start caching through the EAA platform, sometimes it doesn't work, or we have to go back to the offer, the gate's not working, and coming out with a way to troubleshoot that would be challenging.
Or unrepeatable troubleshooting mechanisms so that we don't just keep spinning our wheels every time we run across something that could potentially be a bad issue.
Right. They give you some diagnostic tools in there, like if it caches, there's headers that come in and tell you that it's cached, and so you can get some clues.
Question in the back there.
Yeah, this is a little more of a newbie thing. We're just looking here now, POC a little bit. So the testing the Akamai thing, that's fantastic. So this is almost like even before that. Have you guys tried any? It's not just a person developing testing, but scripting tools. Like we use Perfecto, and so we don't. Do you guys try that kind of thing, or other types of tools, like browser stack that you see those things work, or they're traditionally pretty tough on the security side.
Right.
Yeah,
so that's a
exactly.
good point. So actually, I'm familiar with Perfecto and also Browser Stack. We're actually using Browser Stack, with this. So some of our people that are really particular about the user experience and all that, they're able to load up Browser Stack, go to our staging environment, authenticate, get to the whole experience, and then see how everything flows together. And so far, pretty much all of the logs that you get in the developer console, the Chrome developer console, we've been able to access all of that, with Browser Stack. So that has not been an issue so far, like interoperable. Yeah. I can't speak for Perfecto, but for sure.
For Browser Stack, they definitely set up some tests for it. Yeah.
It really should be transparent to the end user experience, which could be a person or could absolutely be an automation system. One question that I actually had for you guys is because that ties into this. Because this you painted a great picture of how easy this is to do and how it circumvented the internal bureaucracy, the heavy lifting to sort of prop up environments in your DMZ. Do you see yourself in the future, not tomorrow, but do you see yourself in the future, as Bhushan said, leveraging more APIs, automating more, and essentially giving your development team the ability, the controls, without having to go to networking and InfoSec to prop up more test environments, to enable more of the team, again, earlier in the life cycle to do that kind of testing?
For sure. Right now what we're working on is we were talking about a little bit before, it was like we wanted to be able to hit the API, the web API, in the in the test environment from the UI. So that way, UI developers don't have to worry about the back end at all. They can just say, well, I don't need to point to any of the back end servers. All I have to do is point to that test API environment, and I can mess with the UI, figure things out while I'm just pointing to the existing web APIs that we know are working, and it's a known issue. So, yeah.
Excellent, love it. Oh, another question over here.
Have you guys seen any latency introduced by improvements out there? Like you compare your prod environment that doesn't take advantage of the connector versus the environments that are taking advantage of the connector?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So the question was, for the folks way over there, the question was, have you seen latency introduced into this architecture? And then maybe I'll add to that, if there was any latency, did it affect testing or the end user experience in any sort of impactful way?
Right. I don't think there was any. So I don't think we wanted to compare production versus non-production, because that's
Right.
exactly not it's not an apples to apples comparison, because production has a lot more things going for it. But if you were to compare, let me take an existing test environment that was running without EAA, you're able to access that internally. You compare that to an experience that was going through EAA, we didn't really see any big difference in terms of latencies or anything like that. Again, like I said, there's some interesting things. So, as part of the investigation, we wanted to enable the front-end optimization, module. We did that. We found some, interesting things. So I think we're working through all of it. I don't think we've had any big issues that were like blockers. It's just been, hey, get on a call with, Bhushan or one of these guys, and we work through it, set it up in the portal, and we're good to go. So it's been a fairly easy, interaction and getting all those things set up.
Question over here.
So in our pre-production environments, quite a lot of customers do we have fake Akamai. And, I guess in some ways it's a good thing because people are iterating quickly. You don't have to worry about things like cache. Do you have issues with caching in the way or something?
Yeah,
For sure.
actually, we're working through the caching configuration. In some cases, we don't want caching. In some cases, you want
Sometimes
caching.
you want to turn on, sometimes
right?
you want to turn it off.
So
Yeah.
our policies are kind of, because of that, our policies are somewhat different between, production and non-prod. But for the key pages of the experience, when we test, we want to make sure that the policies are consistent and we're getting exactly what the customers, would see. But you can certainly disable caching for whichever page or URL or application that you want it to, because that's just a policy that you configure.
Are you doing anything special to keep your Akamai configurations the same?
Yeah, that's the tool that he was showing. So actually, you can
Yeah.
set a policy, and we're using the Akamai APIs to migrate the policy. So you set it up the way you want it for your test environment, and then you can use this tool to kind of run tests. And once it's good, we push that to the staging production config, and then we push it live from there. We're kind of working through that process, but
We can add handrails around it so it can do some transform, saying some of these things should be in this environment, never in another environment. You can, we're going to put handrails around that so it's automatically transformed. And part of that too is the automated testing around caching too. So one thing we want to add next is like really hit that automated testing of caching. So we can say this is what we hit when it's cached, this is what it looks like when it's not cached, so be able to turn that A/B testing on and off regarding caching, yeah.
We are getting close to time. I'll try to squeeze in 2 more questions. If we can't get to it, I'm going to stick around afterwards. I'd be happy to field some questions and chat outside. But you, sir, had a...
So can you take a moment and talk about with regard to EAA and the developer experience specifically and their access to the tools they need and the deployment stuff, and what the initial acceptance factor and how that kind of process went through guys?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, people are starting to jump on it right away because before we had to remote into the testing environment. You have to go into remote desktop, jump in that environment, and then test on that. And it was a real pain, and you certainly couldn't do anything from your browser. You have all these dev tools on your Chrome and all this stuff, and you can't use that in that remote desktop environment. So it was really neat to be able to sit there and hit this page from your desktop with all the tools you're used to testing on there. So
It's more restricted to developers. It's
Yeah, and in some ways it's less restrictive because it's the same login as, because otherwise you have to open up the remote desktop app and then log in, and then it takes a while, and you got a blurry screen that's not yours, and none of your tools are there. Whereas otherwise you just go to the website and say test g4.dell.com, you log in like you normally would, and you're in. Now after that, you never have to log in again. It's as if you had remoted into that box, but now you have a browser. Yeah.
Yeah, the product in general is part of Akamai's enterprise strategy around security, zero trust, pushing security out to the perimeter. We have really smart folks like Bhushan and smart customers, like our friends here at Dell, who realized very early on, once they got a product briefing about this, that they could apply this to their development system, and essentially, because it's clientless, because it's seamless to the end user, all of it, you can run this natively, or you're not running the solution, but essentially the solution's in the background. The end user experience is through a browser, just as it would be for a customer sitting out on the public internet.
Let me just add to that. You talked to, a lot of the users that we're talking about here that you guys are interested in, particular developers, development operations, testing, SDETs, things like that. For them, even it's behind the scenes, but there's a lot of access they have, and I think the acceptance is pretty quick. There's nothing unusual. I think another thing to think about is your user acceptance testers, your business testers, your executives that may not know how to use Perfecto, which we used to use, or browser stack, a little comfortable there. They can just get on a device, especially mobile devices, and start testing. So they don't see anything. The plumbing's behind the wall, and for them, executing globally user acceptance tests on their phone and the tablet walking around is, for them. So there's a lot of business community bridges that you're going to build as well.
Yeah, being able to just log in from your phone, just like I'm seeing a problem on Android, and you pick up the phone, it's like show me. You can log in, you see it right there in the test environment. It's not in any other test environment, just that environment. That's really nice. Any other questions?
Any last questions? Or
We have probably time for one more, and then we're going to get the hook. Any other questions? Going once? So the question was, has Dell tied it into Kona yet, like we saw in the keynote?
Not yet. No, we haven't gone that far yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Polluted. Yeah,
So
that's a
the
good
question was,
question.
how do you manage your Akamai config? So putting EAA aside for a second, how do you manage do change management and team management around the Akamai?
That's a super good question. Yeah, right now it's separate policies, and we're working on a system right now where we can do version controls of it and have a transform that can do that migration automatically. Right now it's just the migration. It's just first stage. It's the first iteration of it, and it just copies, blow, and drops the whole thing. Control C, Control V almost. And so the next step is to start putting those transforms in there, saying like, if you're going from this environment to this environment, take these things but not these. This also not that. That kind of transforms. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the first step is to because we just did this recently, so we got to match the QA and the staging config with the production, and then slowly we can figure out how the migration path needs to be from the lower environments into production.
And then really also roll it out. So I think to your question back here is on how you troubleshoot things when we start testing at scale.
Right.
Because right now we're not testing at scale. Really, it's sort of us, a couple of executives, a few others. So once we really start pushing the envelope, we might uncover things that we'll have to figure out. But so far we've been able to do that pretty quickly, as Prashant mentioned, with the tool sets and working with these guys.
I love it. I think we're getting the hook, but thank you for the engagement, the interaction, the questions. I love it. Thank you, Dell, for sharing your story. It's a great one.
Thank you, Chris, Prashant. Thank you, Ken. And thank you, everybody, for coming.